The last thing Nadia Orel expected on a Tuesday, fine, any day of the week, was to become the punchline of a joke told by the most dangerous man in Montreal. She had been a forensic accountant for 11 years. She knew how to make herself small in a room, not physically. That particular trick had been beyond her since she was 14, and decided she liked butter chicken more than she liked being uncomfortable. But professionally, she had a gift for it. Sit near the wall, keep the folder close, answer only what is asked. She had perfected the art of being present without being noticed, which was exactly what you wanted when the people signing your paycheck ran their business through a combination of offshore shell companies and quiet menace. The Ardellan Group occupied 4 floors of a glass tower on René Levesque, and on paper, it looked like any other private holdings firm. Nadia had done the books for 3 different clients like this over the years. She knew how to read the shape of a ledger without asking what moved through it. She was good at her job because she never needed to understand the whole picture. She only needed the numbers to balance. They always balanced. That was the thing about men like Corvin Dragon. Everything always balanced. She had been briefed on him the way you might brief someone on a natural disaster. Not if, but when. And here are the protocols. He was 41. Born in Bucharest, raised in Toronto, built an empire in the grey space between legitimate business and organized violence. He had the kind of face that photographers loved at fundraising galas. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that didn't smile even when his mouth did, and the kind of reputation that kept the table next to his permanently empty at restaurants. People made room for Corvin Dragon the way they made room for weather. Nadia had been hired by the Ardellan Group 6 weeks ago to do a Q3 reconciliation. She'd worked remotely until this week, when she'd been asked, politely, which somehow felt more frightening, to present her findings in person. She arrived at the 32nd floor at 8:45 on a Wednesday morning. The receptionist, a young woman with the carefully neutral expression of someone paid to absorb shock, pointed her toward the boardroom at the end of the hall and said nothing else. The boardroom was already occupied. Corvin Dragon sat at the head of the table with the loose, unhurried posture of a man who had never once in his life been asked to wait. 2 men stood near the window, hands clasped, watching Nadia enter with the flat assessment of people who evaluated threats for a living. A 3rd man, younger, with a neat suit and an anxious energy, stood slightly behind Drogan's chair with a tablet in hand. Nadia stepped in, set her laptop bag on the table, said, "Good morning. I'm Nadia Orel. I know who you are." Drogan didn't look up from the document in front of him. He turned a page. "Sit." She sat. She opened her bag. She arranged her materials with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been in uncomfortable rooms before and had learned that the best response to rudeness was to simply not let it land. He looked up. It was the first time he actually looked at her, and Nadia had been looked at like that before. That slow, clinical scan that wasn't admiration and wasn't disgust but was something worse, which was appraisal. The kind of look that added things up and found the total unimpressive. "They sent me an accountant," he said, "not a partner." The younger man behind him, she would later learn his name was Philip, very carefully stopped breathing. Nadia clicked her laptop open. "They sent you their most accurate accountant, which, given what I found in your Q3 receivables, you'll be grateful for. Shall I begin?" A beat. Dragan set down his page. She had expected him to say something. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and studied her with a quality of attention that she associated with people who were trying to determine whether something was valuable or simply unexpected. It was not a comfortable kind of attention. It was the attention of a man who made decisions about things. "Begin," he said. Nadia began. She had prepared a clean, 17-page summary with flagged anomalies cross-referenced to source documents. She walked through it the way she walked through everything. Methodically, without apology, with the particular confidence of someone who had spent 11 years being the smartest person in the room, and had only recently stopped trying to hide it. Halfway through page 4, she caught the inconsistency that had been nagging at her since the first read-through. "This transfer," she said, and tapped the screen. "March through June, your Cayman vehicle received inflows from 3 separate source entities. 2 are accounted for. The third runs through a numbered company registered in Liechtenstein, and the documentation you provided gives me the originating bank, but not the beneficial owner. I need the ownership chain before I can sign off." Silence. One of the men by the window shifted his weight. Dragan said, "That entity is not your concern." "With respect," Nadia said, "it became my concern the moment you asked me to attest to these financials. If my name goes on this report, I need the chain. That's not negotiable." The word negotiable landed in the room like something breakable. Dragan tilted his head, just slightly. It was the kind of movement that in another man might have been casual, but on him suggested recalibration. "You do understand," he said very quietly, "that I don't typically have these conversations twice." "I understand that," Nadia said, "and I'm not asking to have it twice. I'm asking to have it once correctly so that I can finish my job and you can have a report that holds up." She kept her voice even. She was aware that her hands, underneath the table, were doing something she would not dignify by calling shaking. "If you'd prefer I leave the entity unresolved, I can note it as an open item and flag the corresponding line as unverified. Your choice." Another silence. Longer this time. Then something moved at the corner of Dragan's mouth. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one. The suggestion that in some other context, under some other circumstances, he might have found something amusing. "Note it as open," he said. "Done." Nadia typed it in. Philip exhaled. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. Nadia gathered her materials with the same methodical calm she'd walked in with, though her coffee had gone cold, and she hadn't touched it. And she was fairly certain she'd been holding her breath through most of page 11. She was in the elevator before she let herself think about what had just happened. She pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. Her hands were shaking now, and she didn't try to stop them. She did not expect to hear from the Ardellen group again. That was not how this kind of engagement worked. You went in, you delivered, you sent your invoice, and the relationship ended with the professional courtesy of people who preferred limited exposure. She was at her desk the following Monday when Philip called. "Mr. Dragan would like to retain your services on an ongoing basis," he said, starting immediately. Nadia looked at the wall. "I'm currently contracted to 2 other clients," she said. "He's aware of that. I have a non-compete clause in both agreements that he's also aware of that." A beat. "He asked me to convey that those arrangements can be resolved without difficulty on your end." She didn't ask what that meant. She had worked adjacent to men like Corvin Dragan long enough to understand that when they said without difficulty, they did not mean the difficulty would be shared. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "Of course." Philip's voice was careful, the way someone's voice gets when they are relaying a message they hope will be received well, because the alternative is an uncomfortable afternoon. He'd appreciate an answer by Thursday. She thought about it for 3 days. She made a list. She looked at the numbers. Her numbers, her own finances, the forensic accountant's version of a pros and cons chart, and she looked at what ongoing work for the Ardellen group would mean. Then she thought about the meeting. About the way Dragan had looked at her when she'd said negotiable, like something he hadn't expected to encounter and wasn't yet sure what to do with. She called Philip on Thursday morning and said yes. She spent the first 3 weeks convincing herself it was a business decision. The Ardellen group operated out of its towers like a contained weather system, and Nadia settled into the rhythm of it, the way you settle into any new environment, by learning the rules before you learned the exceptions. Philip was meticulous and anxious and genuinely kind under the professional veneer. The 2 men from the window, Cale and Dunmore were security, and they acknowledged her existence with the minimal nod of people who had categorized her as not a threat and subsequently filed her away. The rest of the staff treated her with the particular deference reserved for people whose exact status was unclear. She saw Dragon twice in the first week. Both times, he was walking somewhere with the purposeful economy of movement that she was starting to recognize as his default setting, as if the city were a board and he had already determined the optimal path from every point to every other point. And it was everyone else's job to get out of his way. Both times, he looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the boardroom. That same measuring attention. Like he was still deciding. She told herself it didn't matter. On the fourth week, she found a second anomaly. This one was more complicated. It wasn't a missing ownership chain. It was a pattern, a subtle one, the kind that only showed up when you looked at 3 months of transactions together, instead of in isolation. Payments from a legitimate Ardellan subsidiary, running to a Montreal-based numbered company, which then forwarded to a law firm in Ottawa, which then, and this was where it got interesting, forwarded to a private medical foundation that Nadia had never heard of. She cross-referenced the foundation. It was real, registered in 2019, primarily funding pediatric oncology research at 3 hospitals across Quebec and Ontario. She sat with that information for a long time. Then she walked down the hall and knocked on Dragon's office door. "Come in." He was behind his desk, which was large and very clean, as if disorder were something that happened to other people. He looked up when she entered, and she noticed, as she had been noticing, against her better instincts, that he never looked at the door first. He looked at the person. "The Alderton subsidiary transfers," she said. "I need to talk to you about them." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. She laid out her findings the same way she always did, methodically, factually, without editorial. When she finished, she said, "The numbers themselves are clean. The structure is clean. I'm not flagging a problem. I'm flagging that I understand what it is now, and I wanted you to know that I understand it." Dragon said nothing for a moment. He was watching her with that quality of attention that she had by now started to think of as its own language, something he did instead of words. "And," he said, "and nothing." She closed her folder. "I don't ask questions about the parts of your business I'm not retained to understand, but I don't like not knowing what I'm looking at, and now I know. That's all. That's all," he repeated, like he was testing the weight of it. "Yes." He leaned back, looked at her. "You know," he said, "the last 3 people in your position either pretended not to notice or asked me to explain myself. What happened to them? The ones who pretended left. The one who asked is still with us and has, I suspect, developed a mild anxiety disorder." A pause. "You did neither." "I did a third thing," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You came and told me what you knew." Another pause longer. "Why?" Nadia thought about it honestly. "Because I'd rather you know that I know than have you find out later and wonder what I'd done with the information." He looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said finally, "is an unusually rational thing for someone in your position to say." "I'm an accountant," she said. "I find irrational positions uncomfortable." The ghost of a thing crossed his face again, that almost expression. "Go back to work, Ms. Aurel." She went back to work, but she noticed afterward that he had used her last name, not her first, not the accountant. Her last name, which meant he had been thinking of her as a specific person and not a category of role. She filed that information away and told herself, firmly, that it did not mean anything. Trouble arrived on a Thursday, as trouble often does when it has no respect for scheduling. She was working late. The Q4 preliminary was due, and she had 3 unreconciled items that were refusing to cooperate. When she heard the voices from the corridor, she wouldn't have paid attention except that one of them was Philip's, and Philip spoke in the same measured tenor at all times, and right now his voice had a different quality. Higher, tighter. "Mr. Dragon, I don't think this is—" "Leave it," she heard footsteps. Then the door to the small conference rooms adjacent to her workspace opened and Kale stepped through, first, which was never a good sign. And then Dragon, and behind him 2 men she didn't recognize, broad, silent, with the deliberate blank expressions of people who were pretending they weren't calculating exits. One of them looked at her and then looked at Dragon. "She's here," the man said, with a particular inflection that made the words mean something else. "She works here," Dragon said. His voice was very flat. "Leave her out of it." The man looked at Nadia again, not threatening, evaluating, like she was information he hadn't expected. Nadia looked back at him with the expression she had refined over 11 years of sitting in rooms where she was the least powerful person and had learned that the worst thing you could do was let anyone see that you knew it. "I can step out," she said. "You don't need to step out," Dragon said. His eyes hadn't moved from the 2 men, gentlemen, the hall. There was a moment, a particular quality of stillness, and then the 2 men went into the hall. The door closed. Nadia sat very carefully still. Dragon turned. He looked at her, and something had shifted in his face. Not alarm, because she was fairly certain alarm was not an experience he was capable of, but something that sat in its approximate neighborhood, a recognition of complication. "My apologies," he said, "for the interruption. It's fine, it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "There is a situation that is going to require me to be unavailable for the rest of the evening. I need you to go home. I have 3 items that need to—" "Nadia," he said her first name. It was the first time he had said it directly to her, and it landed differently than she expected. Not formally, not with the distance of a professional address. Like something he'd been holding and set down. "Please go home." She went home. She was in the elevator when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Mrs. Orell, a voice she didn't recognize. Smooth. Careful. "I understand you've been working very closely with the Ardellan group. I'd like to talk to you about that." She said nothing. "I'm going to guess," the voice continued, "that you've seen some things. Interesting things. The kind of things that, properly understood, could be very useful to—" "I'm a forensic accountant," Nadia said. "I work with financial documents. I see numbers." A pause. "I think you have the wrong person." She hung up. She stood in the lobby of her building for a moment, staring at the phone. Then she called Philip. "Someone just contacted me," she said when he picked up. "Unknown number. They knew I worked for Ardellan and they asked about what I'd seen." A silence. "Don't go back to your apartment tonight," Philip said. His voice was very careful. "Stay somewhere else. A muffled exchange. "I'll call you back in 10 minutes. He called back in 4. "Someone will be at your building in 20 minutes, he said. "They'll take you somewhere safe, Mr. Dragon is. He's been informed." Nadia sat down on a lobby bench and thought, with the particular clarity of someone whose adrenaline had briefly overridden her ability to be calm, that she had perhaps underestimated the degree to which her professional judgment and her personal safety had become the same problem. The somewhere safe turned out to be a townhouse in Outremont with art on the walls and an espresso machine that cost more than her car. Kale brought her there and told her, in the minimal language that she was learning was simply how he spoke, that she should sleep, that the situation was being managed, and that someone would update her in the morning. She didn't sleep. She was at the kitchen table with a cold coffee and 3 pages of notes. Because she'd had her laptop in her bag, which meant she'd spent 4 hours doing the only thing that made her feel less helpless, which was working, when she heard the front door. Dragon walked in at 4:15 in the morning. He looked, and she registered this with the part of her brain that processed information before her feelings caught up with it, like someone who had been through something. Not disheveled, because she suspected dishevelment was another thing that happened to other people. But something had moved through him. His collar was open, There was a quality to his stillness that was different from its usual resting state. Like something had been spent. He stopped when he saw her. "You should be asleep," he said. "You should have told me the company I was keeping had produced this level of operational complexity," she said. "I would have negotiated a higher daily rate." He stood there for a moment. Then he crossed to the kitchen, took a glass from the cabinet, and poured himself water. He stood at the counter and drank half of it and looked at her over the rim. "The people who called you," he said. "They won't call again." She didn't ask what that meant. "Okay, you handled it correctly. Calling Philip immediately. Not going back to your apartment. I was a forensic accountant for 3 financial institutions before I went independent. I know what it looks like when someone is fishing for leverage." He put the glass down. "How much of what you know about my operations did you tell them?" I said. "I was an accountant who worked with numbers." She looked at him steadily. "That's all they got from me. That's all they were going to get from me." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair across from her and sat down, which surprised her, because she had a mental model of Corvin Dragan that did not include him sitting in kitchens at 4 in the morning, with his collar open and his water glass. "Why?" he said. She looked at him. "Why what? Why protect my information? You could have used that call to extract yourself from a complicated situation. Walked away clean." Nadia thought about it the way she thought about everything. Honestly, from first principles. "Because I made a professional commitment," she said. "Because my name is on documents that attest to the accuracy of your financials, and that attestation is only worth something if it comes from someone who doesn't compromise when it's inconvenient." She paused. "And because. And I'm telling you this as information, not as a bid for anything. I think you've done more with the money you move than you let people believe, and I think you'd prefer not to have that complicated." The Pediatric Oncology Foundation. She didn't say it. She didn't need to. He understood what she was saying. She could tell by the way he went very still, not with threat, with something more unsettling, which was recognition. "You're very hard to place," he said finally. "I'm an accountant from Sudbury," she said. "I'm not trying to be anything except what I am." "That's..." He stopped, looked at the table between them, then back at her. "That is not something I encounter very often." "I know," she said. "I've worked for enough people like you to understand that." Something in his expression shifted. Not the ghost expression, the almost smile. Something more substantial, more considered. "I owe you an apology," he said. She blinked. "For what? The first day, in the boardroom." He met her gaze. "I assessed you the way I assess most things that enter my space, efficiently and without much thought. I concluded you were likely competent but unremarkable." A pause. "I was wrong about the second part." Nadia sat with that for a moment. It was not conventional apology. It was the kind of apology that a man who was not practiced in the form produced when he felt the obligation of accuracy. She found, to her own mild frustration, that it was more meaningful than a conventional one would have been. "You spent the first 40 minutes of that meeting waiting for me to be intimidated," she said. "Yes, I was intimidated. I was absolutely terrified." She said it with the same flat honesty she brought to everything. "I was just also right about the numbers, and being right about the numbers mattered more." He looked at her. "You were terrified," he said, like he was passing the logic of it. "Of course I was. You have a reputation that precedes you by about 30 feet in every direction. But I've learned that the way you feel about something and the way you handle it don't have to be the same thing. If I'd let you see the terror, you'd have filed me away differently, and I'd have been less useful to you." A pause. "And I needed to be useful. I needed this contract. Why?" It was a blunt question. She answered it bluntly. "Because I have a sister in Vancouver who is dealing with something serious and I was covering some of the cost. And your contract was 3 times the rate I'd been getting elsewhere." He said nothing for a moment. "Is she all right?" Your sister. Nadia looked at him. The question was genuinely careful, the way someone is careful with things they don't fully know how to hold. She's getting there, she said. He nodded. Something settled in him, visibly. Like a decision that hadn't been formally made, was now informally understood. You'll stay here tonight, he said, and tomorrow we're going to renegotiate your contract. He stood up, picked up his water glass. Get some sleep, Nadia. I have 3 items that still need reconciling. Tomorrow, the Q4 preliminary. Tomorrow. He said it, without heat, with the particular firmness of someone who knew how to close a conversation. They'll keep. She watched him walk toward the hall. Corvin, she said. He stopped, turned. She had not planned to use his name. She wasn't sure what made her do it, except that it felt like a moment that required it, like something should be marked, named, acknowledged. Thank you, she said, for tonight. For managing whatever needed to be managed. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing where it held more information than it released. Don't thank me yet, he said. The rest of the week is going to be difficult. I'm an accountant, she said. I like difficult problems. Something finally broke through. Not the ghost smile, not the almost expression, but the actual thing. Brief, unexpected. The kind of smile that looked like it didn't get much use. I know, he said. That's the problem. He left her at the kitchen table with her cold coffee and her 3 unreconciled items, and the specific disorienting sensation of being, for perhaps the first time in her professional life, genuinely seen by someone she had not intended to be seen by. She looked at her laptop, then she closed it. The numbers could wait until morning.